Hey everyone, welcome to Josette's Soul Salon, where we have weekly conversations that answer the question, what does it take to live a soul expressed life? I'm your host, Josette Leblanc, and during this episode, I speak with the three luminaries, Anika Apple, Kailei Carr, and Leilani Mañulu about balancing the divine feminine and masculine at the personal and collective levels. The world is currently in the process of radically filtering out toxic masculinity and seeking new ways of being and doing across cultures and industries. Human culture has been out of balance for a while and has faced a lot of destruction because of it. So, how can we bring more balance into the world and our lives? In this conversation with Leilani, Anika, and Kailei, we answer this question. The three luminaries are divine channels offering pathways for light seekers to reconnect with their inner light and bring their lives into greater alignment. They all have backgrounds and expertise in supporting leaders in a variety of spaces and organizations, and use their unique backgrounds to support and guide light seekers in arriving home to themselves in hopes of bringing our collective forward. You'll want to listen to the end to hear how you can foster your own connection to Source and create even more alignment in your life. I also have some exciting news to share, so again, be sure to listen to the end. To connect with the three luminaries, check the links in the show notes. And if you enjoy what you hear, make sure to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review. Now let's get into the salon. All right, I am so excited to be with the three luminaries, Anika, Leilani, and Kailei. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for being here. So how about we start off with discovering who the three luminaries are? Could you tell us who you are first?
I'm going to start, and I'm going to invite my sisters, Kailei and Anika, to join in. So the Three Luminaries is completely divinely led. The three of us came together in a divine way as well, and into our getting to know one another, discovered that all three of us are divine channels. So we all hear from God, the divine, the universe, however you want to identify your higher power. And it became a very clear mission for the three of us to come together with the sole purpose of allowing these messages to come through for the world to hear, and to also support other, we call them light seekers. So people who are also trying to understand and discover and explore their own inner light and their own divine missions here as well. So we serve as channels, messengers, guides, and models, examples of how to live a life that is divinely led. And we're still discovering, I think, every day what our magic looks like. And right now we offer workshops to support light seekers and what we call finding their way home, which is home to themselves. And I'll open it up to Kailei and Anika to add anything else.
I don't think I have anything else to add. That was so beautiful.
Perfect. Mm-hmm.
Good, because I didn't practice at all.
That was clearly channeled, so it's all good.
Yes.
Perfect, beautiful. Thank you. And I couldn't, there was nobody more perfect for this conversation that we're going to have today about energetic balance. And we can't talk about energetic balance on an earthly level without emphasizing the divine feminine. And so today we're going to focus on the divine feminine with the idea of that focusing on the divine feminine brings everything into balance. And I just want to say that I like to use the word the divine feminine instead of just feminine or feminine and masculine when we're talking about the balance, divine feminine, divine masculine. Because if we use the word feminine or masculine, there can be a tendency for humans to want to genderize. And it's not about gender, it's about energy. And, this energy is not only for humans, it's for everything and everyone on earth. So everything and everyone on earth has divine feminine energy and divine masculine energy. And sometimes that energy is out of whack, like now in this current era of the world. And so I'd like to start with a very simple question of how would you define the divine feminine? And that was a cheeky question. It's not a simple question, but I know that the three luminaries can bring us a lot of wisdom on that. So who would like to jump in?
Okay, well, I can jump in then. So when I think about the divine feminine, I think about all of those aspects of humans that are connected, that are intuitive, that are soft, that are the nurturing aspects of ourselves that drive us to our divine connectedness. And those parts of ourselves that collectively see that we are all spiritual beings, and that by connecting with each other and connecting with our divinity, then we are all reflections of God. So it's not I don't know if I have a concise definition, but that's what I think of when I think of the divine feminine.
I love that. Drive us to our divine connectiveness. That's the intention of it. I love that. That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, what's coming through in this moment, what I'm sensing is, and almost like the most simplistic way that I've been able to grasp these very complex concepts of divine feminine and divine masculine, is the divine feminine really representing the unseen, and the divine masculine really representing what we see, what we can like sense with our human senses here. What comes to mind, and I know we're going to dive all up in this, but what comes to mind is the ways that we have undervalued the divine feminine where we are as a culture and a collective today, is that we've gotten so far out of trusting our divine feminine, our intuition, our divine connection, our spiritual connection, that we have gotten to a place where masculine has now become toxic. It's no longer divine masculine that we're experiencing here. It's so out of balance that we've gotten to a place where instead of really understanding and unpacking like the power that is our divine feminine, our intuition, the unseen, we've gone to a place where we're beginning to now worship things like money and time, and it's gotten to this place that's so out of whack. So I think in order to understand the divine feminine, we have to also understand the ways that the masculine has been overvalued in the culture that we live in today. So that was what was coming through in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's super important to be able to look at something. This is the world we live in. We need to see, look at the contrast of something in order to understand another. And that's the beauty of this world. And even all one specific energy will have the opposite also. So as you mentioned, the divine masculine, once it's overemphasized, it becomes toxic. Same with divine feminine energy. If we're always always in the soft and nurturing, like intuitive space, it's that gets out of balance too, right? And so, but yes, it's so true. And we're definitely going to dive into this topic of the toxicity that we're facing. Anika, would you like to add to that?
I was just going to say, you said the perfect word there, imbalance, right? Because it's just this over dominance that we have experienced in masculinity. And I think, like, to Leilani's point, everything is supposed to be in balance. That's how it was created. And if I think about coming from a place where we look at spirituality, there's a definition of spirituality as belief or faith, something, connection to something that is unseen. And when you go back to kind of the roots of both what Kailei and Leilani were talking about, the divine feminine is the piece that is unseen. It is trusted. It's imperative that it is there, but you can't just kind of, do hash marks and tabulate the ways in which it is impacting things in the way that you can what is seen. And we have become a society that has this overemphasis or dominance in, but what can I see? What can I track? What can I measure? What can be produced? And in many ways, we've forgotten that things that are produced come from a balance of both divine feminine and divine masculine, or feminine and masculine, or, and I think that is, it's an interesting, I know we're going to drive down this road, so I won't get ahead of myself, but it's just such an interesting piece to think about what we value today versus maybe what was intended in initial value when we first began on this journey as humans.
Oh, that's so good. What was intended when we started this journey. Oh, so good. It's very interesting that this point of the unseen, and you would think about how much suffering has happened because, I think of like the witch hunts and so on. And because there were things, I mean, there's a lot more to that, but basically that's a great example of how they couldn't see, the unseen was not being trusted, or the unseen was being, I'm not finding my language right now, but
it was feared.
Yes, feared.
Right.
Thank you.
Like I think, sorry to like jump, but I
Please.
just felt like a ton of energy around this. There is in this imbalance, like there's this natural tendency to want to like snuff out anything that looks like it's too divine feminine, right? And we see it happening even today. I mean, there's this, the toxicity of like what we can see and track, and there's this polarization that's happened that now folks like us who are, I mean, for the most part, I feel like the three of us really try and are trying to find balance and continue. I mean, it's a continual journey to find balance between the divine feminine and divine masculine. But I came from a very like masculine corporate, that was my life. And then to come to this other side where I am very much living, into my divine feminine. It's even scary for me with like my internalized toxic masculinity, right?
Mm-hmm.
To think that I'm not going to survive really prioritizing my divine feminine. So there's this fear that I think anytime there's this attempt to come back into balance where, like you just said it, the, Salem witch trials and all of that, like there's this energy around, okay, we have to keep things the way they are, because women, especially standing in their divine feminine, like the risk is the world we know it can fall away, right? The world as we know it, there's this risk that it's going to crumble and fall. And there's fear in that. Like there's fear in destruction, there's fear in letting go. And it's valid. Like we can look at, the gatekeepers that are trying to keep this toxic masculinity in place. And we can look to them with empathy and say, I see that you're afraid, and kindly step out of the way, right? Like it's both.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what was coming through in that moment.
It's like, you don't want it to fall away, but it needs to.
Right.
So you may not be recognizing, because you're so beholden to what is, that there's a whole nother version that's so much better and greater, and where you would be happier if you would just allow the change to occur. Like if there's like, I feel like I have a message every day from somewhere that is telling me to stand in my divine feminine. Things are shifting, and it's because you're standing in your divine feminine. You need to lean more into your divine feminine. Anika, tap into your heart. Not that any of my soul sisters here would say that, but at least once a day from each. So it's the reality. And if I look back at where I was 4 months, 6 months, 2 years ago to where I am now, I would never pick to stay the way that I was. And I still have a journey ahead. And so I think that is some of the beauty of the work that we are building here, where we can encourage people to just have a little bit more grace to see what possibilities exist, in the hopes that they will allow themselves to go on the journey to really find what balance looks like inside, and then join in helping define what it looks like on the outside for all of us.
So beautiful. And what I hear and what both of you are saying, and maybe Kailei can speak on this, or whoever wants to jump in, but what I hear is their trust in the idea of surrender is required in order for us to be able to lean into the divine feminine. So the concept of surrendering, of letting go, of knowing the future, is really the biggest part of this leaning into the divine feminine, because the fear is built on prediction and being able to predict what's coming, right? So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how Leilani described the divine feminine being the unseen. And so when you think about this powerful part of all of us that guides us, that directs us, that we need to trust in, right? But we've been told that in order for us to trust in anything, there needs to be evidence, physical evidence. And so this requires us to dismantle and just identify all of the ways in which we've been culturally conditioned, right? To lean into and hold on a pedestal, honestly, are the masculine parts of ourselves. So I do believe that there's this shift happening, and even as it was, I think it was December of 2020 when there was like the Great Conjunction or what have you, and people were talking about it was a separation of the earth, and that we were it was creating two earths, and there is a high level of consciousness and a low level of consciousness, and that we would see this manifest in terms of the polarization, and we're still seeing it, right? And it wasn't until this moment in this conversation where I realized, oh, it's almost like the toxic masculine or the wounded masculine is being amplified in one earth, and the divine feminine is being amplified in the other. And it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Oh,
Yeah,
gosh.
Leilani, go.
Yeah.
I can feel this open up a can of worms. Oh my God, I love that. Two earths.
What came forward in that moment is also the responsibility of those of us who are experiencing this higher consciousness. It's not like we can just leave behind our siblings who are not getting it, right? We have a responsibility especially as light workers, right? To be able to build the bridge so that we're not just like abandoning our fellow collective, that's what came through as I was hearing you talk, Kailei, is it would be so simple to be like, I'm just going to go live in a commune and like, y'all, good luck with that toxic, like, I love how you called it the wounded masculine, like good luck. Let me know how that goes. I'm gonna be out in the woods and you can't find me. So, and it's so tempting, right? It's so tempting to just be like, I just want to live in peace with like my angel brothers and sisters and siblings who just get me. And it's not what we're called to do, especially in the call that we have as Three Luminaries. We have a responsibility to be bridge builders, bridge maintainers. Like it's part of what we have to do.
Yes, and that's why you are here on earth and here speaking your truth so we can get into action. This is the point. This is the point. Oh, so good. This is it. We're creating a new earth. That's it. Wow. Okay. Where do we go from here? Is anybody feeling called to share more, or should we dive into another question? Another question. All right. When did you first, I'm curious because you're all from different backgrounds, and let me just contextually, I like to say you're all in the States, right? In the United States, but from different parts of the United States. Leilani is in Seattle, and Anika, and I'm pointing because you're looking, you're like this to me. You're in Atlanta, Georgia, right? Is that how? Okay.
Correct. Yes.
Yes. So, so the question, and with your backgrounds, this question of when did you first become aware of the concept of the divine feminine, and how has that affected your personal circles? I would love to know about that, because it for everybody has a different definition of it, but a different experience of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can jump in first. So the first time I even heard about the concept was probably about 4 years ago, three or 4 years ago. So fairly recently, honestly. And a friend of mine who's also in the coaching, kind of women's empowerment space, for lack of better term, I saw her lead this conversation around the divine feminine and the divine masculine compared to the wounded feminine and the wounded masculine. So I can't even, claim anything in terms of that term. That's my friend Akene Onu, who was talking about it. And it was so beautiful because it was easy to see how it's not based on gender. It is based on behavior. And for the divine masculine, we know what toxic masculinity looks like. With the divine, or with the wounded masculine is toxic masculinity. The wounded feminine is like the damsel in distress, right? And the manipulator who has been wounded so much, and now she is using, and I'm saying she to illustrate this, but it really put into clarity how important balance is. And if we all could tap into both of the divine aspects of our femininity and masculinity, then it will change everything. And it also made me think about the Trinity, right? And I consider myself a Christian. And when I think about the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, it's like, oh, well, really, I think Jesus is the divine masculine. And I know Anika and I have talked about this. The Holy Spirit is the divine feminine. And God, sorry, y'all, I don't think God is a he. God is a they. So, I'm gonna stop there because I know my sisters have a lot to say here.
It's like, this is like double Dutch. I'm ready to jump in, right? So check, and God has said that they're not male or female, which is why I'm working he out of my vocabulary, and it's deeply rooted in there, my, upbringing in religion. But it's very clearly like God is source is all encompassing. And so how, if you're all encompassing, and it's funny, right? Because I am doing a sermon in a couple of weeks, and I literally was writing about this earlier today, that, I posed the question, I'm like, so if I was made in your image and I'm female, like, how does that really work? And I have a pastor, who's the first person I've ever heard of in religion who refers to Holy Spirit as she. And that really resonated with me. So I was like, oh, I really like that. So yeah, Kailei, like 100% agree. And I would add, like, for me, I went to an executive presence workshop and then participated in a program that a company that I worked for. So it was interesting to meet this concept in corporate America, because the valuation was definitely more for divine masculine. But they had selected, actually, we helped to select the facilitators for the sessions that we were going to have. And we picked this agency that was in Chicago, and it was woman-owned. And they were amazing. I credit them for many of the shifts that have happened in my career. But in that session in particular, they were talking about owning our own power. And finding this balance. And in particular, this is so salient for me. We were doing a values exercise, and so they had a values deck, and we were to go through and select. And of course, you select 12 or whatever, and then basically you're narrowing it down to 5. And I was stuck because I had 6 values. And this one card I just kept trying to put back, but it kept coming back out over and over again. And so the coach said to me, she's like, Anika, what's going on? Because you've been wrestling with that for a long time, basically like, let's move on in the exercise. And she's like, what card is it that you're struggling with? And I said, love. And she said, well, what's the struggle? And I was like, because I just feel like it's a value, but I just don't feel like it belongs here. And she was like, but it's your value as an individual. And so, I won't take you through the rest of it, but ultimately it was like calling out to me that here's a piece of yourself that you are saying, you keep pulling to it, it keeps pulling to you, because it's actually at the core of who you are. It is your core value. I now will very easily say love is my core value, right? But it was the desire to repress that because it didn't fit into the environment. And so there were just so many things. I don't know that I would have coined it divine feminine there, but that is absolutely what they were teaching us, to be able to bring all of the brilliance of who we were and to not try to define it based on what was acceptable, but instead to be our best selves and allow that to be more than enough in whatever rooms we were in. Then I went to a session that Kailei hosted, and Eke Uno, who Kailei was just talking about a moment ago, talked about the concepts, and it all just came rushing back. And I'm like, this is it. And so it is beautiful that it's woven into things like insights and some of the other ways in which we help to understand personality types, et cetera. But it's not talked about in the way that it needs to be pronounced, especially at this time in our lives. So, and I know we'll come back to more of that, but I want to let Leilani come in here.
Yeah. So mine is a little different. And I really this is one of the things I love the most about the Three Luminaries is we all have these different orientations with which we approach the work that we do. And so my background, devout Catholic upbringing, it was actually in my just late teens, early 20s, the church just felt traumatic to me. I had some experiences that I won't get into that I was kind of feeling done. And it's something that I'm reckoning and grappling with even today. So my sisters know all about this. And so for me, my orientation with the channeling and everything came less from being in kind of a religious setting. And so in a lot of ways, it kind of I feel like I had more of this blank slate with which to engage my work with God, the universe, source. And so the divine feminine, divine masculine, interestingly, the first time I really became aware of this was I was working with a body worker. So she was a somatic, just body worker. And she would just always mention oh yeah, that's your mother's side. That's your father's side, when she was working on my body. And I'd be like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And so she was the first one that really started to help me understand okay, so the right side, she'd be working on my right side. And I would just start feeling father wound stuff come up, or she'd be working on my left side. And so for me, it was the physical body that helped me begin to connect with this notion of feminine and masculine and how it had kind of taken shape within my body. That was, a good 12, 15 years ago. And the next time it really came up for me was when I started, and anyone that reads my book, it's called Paradox of the Water Bear, but I talk about this process of bringing people through the veil. And what I realized is a way that my higher power was supporting me in doing that, and knowing which questions to ask were the ways that in my mind's eye, the ways that people were struggling and getting through the veil. So a lot of times it's your right foot is stuck. What is it about your right side? And that's your masculine, that's the scene. And so for me, it became this mode of translating, where are people finding that they're getting hung up in like embodying that balance, that wholeness of who they are. And so for me, I had to get spooled up real quick on like divine feminine and masculine, because for me, and part of my mission and supporting people through the veil, and what that really just means is like to own the wholeness of who they are. I had to understand and interpret those messages of like the left, the right, the feminine, the masculine, and like know which questions were being channeled in that sense. So kind of like, again, a lot of my journey, I feel like, has been very like me in communication with source, with the universe, and less about like, okay, like I haven't sat down and read a book on the divine feminine or any of that. Like a lot of my information comes like purely from my divine connection. And so it feels vulnerable even to say that, because that's trusting the divine feminine to like give me the information I need, right? In a world that requires that I would read books on it and understand what it really means before I start speaking on it like I know anything. It's vulnerable, right? So yeah.
Well, thank you for your vulnerability, because this is a really important topic, and this is something that's coming to me too recently, is this idea that the divine feminine does communicate through our body. And our body is, I mean, that's a lot there to unpack. But it's true too. Like the first time I heard about it was really when I was studying yoga. And this again brings light to the body. And then it was connected to Hindu philosophy. And I was, there's a lot of goddesses in Hindu philosophy. And I was, okay, so the divine feminine is like Saraswati, Lakshmi, all these goddesses, Kali, Durga. And then I was like, not only a few years ago, and I'm raised Catholic also, I was like, well, what does it look like in Catholic religion? And I didn't have an image of that. And that was always my challenge, is like, where does it look like? What does it look like? It doesn't feel right. And it was my introduction to Mary Magdalene that triggered it all. And just how Mary Magdalene when I was raised Catholic was not elevated as a saint. And you all know that, I'm sure. And but through my exploration of her work and her gospel, I was introduced to the concept of Sophia. And I kept looking at this word Sophia. Sophia means wisdom. And I kept looking at what is, okay, well, Sophia. Oh, so Sophia is the counterpart to God. I didn't know there was an actual counterpart to God in my religion. I always thought it was like outside, and it just blew my mind. That was just a few years ago. And I'm like, and this is what's so interesting to me, is that we were all introduced to this concept in our later years. It's not something we grew up on. We grew up on stories that, again, Mary Magdalene is an example of demonizing the divine feminine, or not understanding it, or whatever, misinterpreting it. So maybe on that note, in terms of misinterpretation of wisdom, because that is one way that the divine feminine is described, is the wisdom. I don't know, Anika, do you have anything you want to add?
You know it.
Yeah.
So it's funny because one of the things that God led me to do early on in this journey was to start the Pearls of Proverbs, which is on YouTube. And it basically is a journey through the book of Proverbs. And how I would say that I was connected with it was like, to help understand how to take the wisdom and instruction from that book and apply it to daily living. So how do you talk about it in simple terms? And I was like, why did you pick me to do this? And even listening to you in this moment, I was like, aha, and there's another link in the chain. So wisdom is, clearly it's a book of wisdom and instruction. It is all in the book of Proverbs. And every single time wisdom is described as she. So is the Holy Spirit is defined as wisdom and discernment that lives on the inside of us. And if you link those two things together, it goes back. So Kailei and I are right. So somebody write that down somewhere. We are like, there is an importance to the divine feminine that is repressed. Why didn't you know about it in your religion? Because it was repressed. It's the same reason that Mary Magdalene is not there. It's the same reason that we've called God he, and even the Holy Spirit he, without any, like, even as a novice, I'm like, wisdom is she all the time. Why is that? And there are a lot of things that are, the fool is always referred to as he. And so it's just very interesting how we pick and choose. The fool is like often used to just counter wisdom, not necessarily a specific person, but someone who's being foolish in their behavior. And so it's very interesting that is connected to, he or the male gender, right? And while wisdom is connected to she, or the female gender, if, we want to bring the concept of gender into it. And so I think at the end of the day, we have picked and chosen across, the history of religion, the places in which we want to elevate, the divine feminine versus the divine masculine. And I think to the earlier point about people being fearful of power, and really, I would say, the male leadership within religion, being fearful of power, that they've repressed a lot of the information, people, like Mary Magdalene, from gaining the prominence that they should have had. In building the early church in Christianity, especially within the Black church, the women were the ones that pulled people together in rooms or houses and taught, and really kept everything going in society, right? And so there was a lot of pride in who they were. And when you look at what's happened with how things have deteriorated over time, again, it's like the male counterparts who are always elevated. So it stands to reason that historically, where there has been prominence of the divine feminine, whether it's in the way a leader behaved or in the way that women had a role, that it has somehow been erased or de-emphasized in our history. And Josette knows, one of my favorite things to talk about, we had just a ball going back and forth of this, is that I get fired up about the story of Adam and Eve. And in short, if you go back and look at this in the Bible, where everyone knows that, within Christianity, that Eve eats the apple. So she took from the tree and was tricked, fooled by the snake, and now is the root of all things that have happened that are evil. But if you read along in the story, she eats of the apple and she shares the apple with Adam, who also eats from the apple. And when God comes back to confront them, she's honest about going to the tree and eating from the apple. And Adam takes no responsibility for the fact that he is the leader of the family, which is his role, and also defers what the question that God asked. God actually asked him the question multiple times to get clarity from him. And we never hear anything about that behavior, that intention to deceive, and also to cast blame. He blamed Eve. It is because of her. She did this, right? And so it's as far back as it goes, at least in my mind, that what was built to be two sides of the same coin, right? Divine feminine, divine masculine, that there's already a battle if those two represent the first kind of human, versions of someone leading with one or the other. So I think that there is this belief that they're supposed to be in competition. And that really is not what divine feminine, divine masculine are. They inhabit each of us and are intended to help us find, seek, and hold balance. And we are so laden with the measurement of things that we forego the importance of divine feminine. And what we know about this time in the world, and what Kailei was alluding to earlier with the separations of the earth, is that we are in such a significant imbalance that we can never get back. without having a significant amount of divine feminine coming forward, people who are not using it, living into it, and those that have done really well with being able to either balance or live into divine feminine and bring along their divine masculine to help teach and rebalance the world.
Oh, thank you for that. I love what you said about the competition piece. It's that's how it's been set up. It's not what is, it's what's been set up by the intellect, right? By some people, just because, for whatever, for gain, right? So thank you for illustrating that, because that story about Eve, I had no idea that it was articulated that way, because I sorry, Grandma, I never read the Bible, but so, you know, but so, yeah, so thank you so much for sharing that. And I should say grammer, because I would never call her grandma, sorry. Okay. Kailei, do you have anything to add to that, or anything else that you feel like you want to call in on this topic of new earths or anything? Yeah.
You knew it. You
Oh,
knew
yeah.
it. Something that is coming up for me is this idea that we need to stop thinking so much. We think too much. And as Anika was talking, and as we've had this conversation, what's coming to me is that we need to lead with the divine feminine. We've been taught we lead with the divine masculine, and the action and getting things done, and you do that first. And we've suppressed the divine feminine, our intuition, the ways in which we connect and nurture. But what I'm realizing in this moment, I don't know if I've really thought consciously about it until now, is that we have to lead with the divine feminine. Then we can go to the divine masculine. Then we can follow it up with action. But if we do it the other way around, we're going to get off course. It's going to take longer. It's going to be less efficient. But if we start with our inner guidance, with our wisdom, then we are so much better off. And then we are also more focused to take the action we need to get things done. So that's what was noodling in my head.
Well, it's so much more efficient, right? I
Yes.
mean, when we think about, and I'm guilty of this, especially as I've been exploring the role that divine feminine plays in my life in the last couple of years, which everyone on this call knows, but your listeners might not know that I blew my life up and quit my corporate job and divorced my husband at the time. And kind of like, because the spirit was telling me that I was out of alignment. And I saw that in every space. I was deeply depressed and anxious. I was medicated. I was doing all of the survival things. And there came this tipping point where it was like, okay, like, if you don't start paying attention to your divine feminine, you will like probably die, because this is not, it's not sustainable. And so when I think about just being able and willing to, like, I guess the difference in the ways that I was surviving, which I think what I hear you saying, Kailei, is like the action before like the spiritual connection, which was just like, okay, I guess I need to keep, climbing the corporate ladder. I need to keep doing these things. If I'm anxious and depressed, like maybe I need to, like address the symptoms. Like it was all action, and it was all like things in the physical. And it wasn't until I really started listening and paying attention to what the messages were that were being divinely flowed to me that I got, it was like my path, which looked like a cluttered, like one of those, what is the show, Hoarders? Like that's what my path looked like, which is terrifying because I hate that show. But then the moment I just like surrendered again to this divine voice that was like trying to get me to remember who I was, all of a sudden it was just like the path was just like clear as day and lit up with lights and stones. And you were on my path, Josette. Like, Anika was on my path, Kailei was on my path. And it's the having the guidance is just so much more efficient. I can see myself skipping on these little stones, like, well, there it is, that's lighting up and that's lighting up. But we can't get to that place if we're not trusting and we're not surrendering, right?
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for illustrating that, because I don't think, and again, it's so interesting, the language that comes out, right? I don't think that most people would say that following intuition, divine feminine intuition, is efficient, right? And I love that you use that term, because that's the point. Like, ultimately, like, it's the point. And Kailei said it so beautifully. The intuition leads and the intellect follows. That's the real sequence of events that we were meant to invoke in this human body. And we all have those examples, and that's why. But it's that first step. That first step is the scariest, where you're like, I'm going to make this decision based on how I feel in my heart, in my gut, whatever you want to call it, wherever you feel it's coming from. You make that first decision, and that's where the evidence comes from. The evidence comes from that first step you take.
And sourcing back to, this is something Anika and I talked about the other day, which is like, I'm actually incredibly resourceful, but in the last like couple of years, I've been relying so much on like, okay, spirit, show me. And now I'm like reintegrating. Like, I am actually very good at creating a schedule and creating a routine, and like these ways, this resourcefulness that used to like lead my life, that's now like taken this giant back seat. And now that I have like come back into balance, it's like, okay, I get to like bring those parts, that scheduling, that like there's parts of me that are divine masculine that I get to like reintegrate. And I think it's you, Josette, that have said, like, when you're in this really divine space, your ego, like gets to become a servant to your intuition, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
Of like, you get to make choices then about how to bring back like these. For me, it's been like resourcefulness, like being able to like bring some of that back in. And it's scary, right? Because I'm like, I don't want to get back to that place of like toxicity or like that woundedness, but we can trust that we're held, that will maintain that balance, right? Yeah.
Well, I would love, Anika, I definitely want you to come in here, but this is, I think this is the crux of this podcast that we're having today, is because the ultimate question that this podcast answers is, how are you leading a soul expressed life? Or what can how is this topic helping you lead a soul expressed life? And I think this is the point, and this is how we can bring this big concept into our daily life, right? Anika, please go ahead. And I would love to hear more about how it's coming into your daily lives in this way, how your intuition, the divine feminine, is helping you, balance with the masculine skills that you have. Go ahead, Anika.
Yeah, that's perfect. So I think that the at the core of who we are called to be as beings is that we lead with love, that we are love, that we come from a source that is the source of all things and has asked us to be here with, really at the core of all things, that we love one another, that we accept and love source, and that we love one another. So we are beings of love, and that is divine feminine. And so when you start from that place and you really are focused on love, then everything else can flow from that. And you think about the way that you make decisions and choices when you're standing in a place of love. You think of the way that empathy becomes a part of the way that you lead and make decisions. And so for myself, if I even think about just in my corporate role and environment, I've seen a significant shift of leading with, like what I typically see in corporate America, to showing up and being like, yeah, I'm fully all of who I am. And like, I hear you on that, but how do you feel about this decision? What's the impact that this is going to have on this person, and what's happening in their home? Like, that it's okay to bring in all of those pieces into conversation. And to encourage people to be reflective about things and not just race to a decision to take an action, without thinking about all of the ways that there are possibilities. I like to, and I worked on a leadership team where we called ourselves people of possibilities. And we challenged ourselves to think about more than just what immediately came through. That for me is an example of leading with the divine feminine and still getting to, a place that embraces both divine masculine and divine feminine on the way to coming up with whatever the solution is. From a personal standpoint, I will tell you, and I look at Leilani Square as I say this, is that one of the things that God said to me a couple of maybe last week was that the head has no place in love, that you are supposed to lead from the heart. And that when you lead from the heart, that the mind will then follow. And when I look at our world, we lead from the head. And so how can we have love for one another? How can we have consideration for our brothers and sisters when we're so focused on the head and our ego? And that's power grabs and making decisions that oppress others and things like that, rather than from a place of love. So I think that what I am working to do, because this is work for me, is to tap into how am I feeling about this, and not to just automatically go to my default, which for many years has grown to be, what am I actioning in this moment? Leaning on that divine masculine that I've dialed up. The last thing I'll say is that I would encourage people to think about the way they honor the divine masculine pieces of their lives, of their selves that have become a part of their identity, versus the divine feminine parts of their selves. For a really long time, the divine masculine pieces have been just so tightly woven with my identity. And truly, my sisters, all three of you, have been a part of my journey to let much of that go and to really shift, to have more of a balance of identifying myself through the divine feminine parts of who I am.
I love that. Identifying yourself. Like, that's it. You name it for yourself, not somebody else is not naming it for you. You're defining it for yourself. That's so good. Kailei, how about you?
Sure. When I hear that question, I think about all of the things that I have learned over time to do around trust, obedience, surrender. So how leading with the divine feminine and my intuition shows up for me is, one, trusting and honoring that it is powerful. I mean, years ago, God told me that my greatest gift is my ability for God to speak through me. And so I have held on to that. Now I trust it. I used to say, well, my gut says, and I would say it almost like, yeah, or I would feel something and not talk about it or suppress its power. Honestly, now I honor it. Now I allow it to guide me. I allow it to show up. I allow it to guide how I interact with clients. I'm building out my team in my business. So creating an environment where it is okay to even talk about spirit, for it to be okay to even talk about how our intuition is coming into play. Right now, several of us are reading this book, The Law of Divine Compensation. And it is like, oh my gosh, to think about being in corporate America, having these conversations, it just wouldn't happen. But I do feel like I have the opportunity to create a different type of work environment with aligned people, and to live out my life with my greatest asset, which is my connection with God, which is partially my divine feminine. So that's how it's showing up.
Wow, this is so beautiful. Creating an environment where it's okay to follow your intuition, your heart, your guidance. I think this is the thing that, if we want to give an example of what is possible and what we can do as leaders, or not even leaders, just people living our lives with this idea of let's bring it all into balance, let the divine feminine lead, is we have the power to say, like, this is how I'm leading this team or this group or this business. So for example, for me, like a big part of my business is I'm not going to show up this week because I need to rest. And that is like mind-blowing.
Hey, we don't know anything about that. I was just making a joke because that is literally something that the three of us have been going into great detail about, the ways that we often don't prioritize rest and how that gets in the way of our divine missions. So,
yeah, because
I was just making a joke, and yeah, it's hard.
It's hard. It's super hard. I mean, we're not geared that way. We haven't been raised that way. It's really, that's part of the fear piece, right? Like if I'm not actioning, I love that verb that you used, Anika, if we're not actioning, then we are not worthy of like this life. Or there are so many pieces to that, right? But we are in a beautiful position, and we all know this. This is why we always have this conversation of expansion, contraction, right? The divine feminine is not on a linear timeline, as you know, maybe this is one way to define divine masculine. It has more of a linear timeline. Divine feminine qualities are more nonlinear, spiralic, you know, which, and if you think of the moon, right? The moon has a cycle, 28 days. There's a new moon, it's dark, you don't see anything. That's where intentions are set. And then it goes and it becomes full of ideas, you're able to reflect on what's coming. But yeah, we are now building, the four of us are building businesses, are building lives where we, you know, give permission to people who come work with us, our clients or our coworkers, to actually lead this way. And it's just so exciting. If anyone else has anything to add to that, it's just super exciting. Yeah. So for, let's see, we're almost, I think at the closing here. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you would like to talk about on this topic? Anika?
I don't want to talk about it, and I hope I'm not like hitting a softball in your direction, sis, but one of the things we haven't talked about is maybe the connection of divine feminine to sexuality. So I don't know if you want to talk at all about that.
Let's go for it. I'm open. This is a conversation. This group is a conversation. To me, it's yeah, go for it.
I was feeling it too, Anika. I'm glad you brought it up.
Wow, go for it. I know it's not a curveball, softball, whatever you want to bring it. Go for it.
You can't just bring that up and then not.
No, go ahead.
I was hitting the softball to you.
Oh.
I want you to come in and talk about it.
Okay.
Okay.
So, I mean, the word that is coming to mind again, I feel like this word has come up but the repression, right, of our divine feminine, I think has a lot to do with the ways that we've also repressed ourselves as sexual beings. And again, I feel a lot of that is rooted in the church and the ways that I remember growing up very Catholic, and I was like 12 or 13, my body's changing, I want to touch myself. And they literally told me in Sunday school that was a sin. Like, I can't explore my sexuality as somebody who is like, you know, and so I learned very early on this repression of sexual energy, which again, if we think about divine feminine, I'm not entirely sure, like this is not something I'm super well versed on, but I do feel as though that the divine feminine is very much like the sexual, you know, like sensual, and just being really in touch with our bodies and our cycles. I thought, you know, when you said the moon cycle, I thought of like my period. I'm like, I don't take clients when I'm PMSing and like the first couple of days of my period. I just don't. I have it in my calendar. I'm like, sorry, can't, and I schedule out. I don't tell them all the time. I would. I mean, I think it all comes back to this, like honoring the cycles of our body as well. And I think sexuality has a lot to do with that. And Anika, I do want to hear what you have to say. Yeah.
So you're spot on around it being divine feminine, and divine feminine is ebb and flow, right? So in the cyclical nature, I was just writing a note for myself. I was like, what's interesting is when you talk about not taking clients during your cycle, it's like, because there's a time for pause or rest. And that's kind of like, in Christianity, right? 7 days. On the seventh day, God rested, right? And there was this notion of taking Sabbath, and we think we're not supposed to do that. So a lot of what sits in divine feminine feels like it has become taboo. It's like taboo or repressed. I think that the thing that comes up for me on this topic is like one of my like mind blown emoji. That's like my favorite emoji. Moments when I was talking to Leilani about just this piece about living other lives, and like, is it possible for us to carry some of those experiences or knowledge with us, locked in ourselves, perhaps in our DNA? And then she's like, you got to meet Josette. And, one of my ahas was like, I was having a conversation with someone who is very just so in tune and step with this conversation. And there was a message that had come through for me. And I was replaying that for the person, the female. And she said, I hear little dude or something like that. And so as I was sharing that with her, she was like, it's who I was in an indigenous, my indigenous self in this past life. And she happens to be a lesbian. And so it was a very interesting conversation. And please don't mistake this. I'm not saying that this is rationale for people to go take off and run with. This is a very simple example of my saying there's comfortability with carrying who we have been in other times in our lives. There's pieces that we hold on to. What I know to be true is that we don't leave behind all of our experiences, that we carry pieces with us. There's knowledge, there's learning, there's relationships, there's connections. And Josette can tell you a lot more about that. So make sure that you schedule time with her. And, but in this instance, I'm like, so here is someone who really connects with where they have been in a past life. And perhaps it has an influence on who they are attracted to in this life. And for some reason, that's wrong. And this is such an interesting concept for me, because so are you saying that they should repress and ignore that part of themselves that really truly is natural? Because that's not nurture, that's nature. And so there's so much more of possibilities that we are just so unwilling to hear or listen or believe could possibly be true. And likely upsetting for, the journey, the religious sect that I am a part of. But I also know that this is part of my role, that God has asked me to come and share truth. And God has spoken to me a lot on this topic. And I know that at the appropriate time that I will be able to bring truths forward, and God will prove those things in the way that they have deemed appropriate to people. But we have a lot of this wrong. And, I struggle with one of these areas I struggle with most of this, but really around the idea, the notion that we are not supposed to be sexual beings. I am very sexual. I am very intense, and I think sex is awesome. I dislike the idea that it is supposed to be something that is so taboo and happens in a room with a sheet and like all of that kind of stuff. And it's interesting that that's the way it started, and it has navigated, morphed into what people are okay with, but that's not necessarily the initial intent that God had. So it's okay when we do it sometimes, but not okay at others. I don't like that. And I don't like that it's okay for men to have that dynamic, but it's not okay for a woman too. And so, and all of that doesn't mean that there's something wrong or it's something bad. Like, we just have to get out of our heads around so much stuff. And if we lead with love, then what we would remember is that I can love you even if your way of living is not exactly the same as mine, because it doesn't change anything about who I am to extend love to you. What we do today, though, is judge, and judgment is not right, at least not in my belief system, right? And because God would say, you know, Anika, it's not for you to judge your brother or sister. That is only my role and responsibility. You are just to love them.
Oh, just to love them, just to love them. And this is so, and Kailei, I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this too. It's what I hear you saying is like, my body is important. My body is not only important, but it's why we like incarnated into these human forms. Like, so first we have to understand that, you know, the idea you were alluding to or explaining, you know, that we have past lives, and this informs the body that we are always incarnating in. That's something, if you want to wrap your head around that, that's okay. But, and then the other thing that you're saying, that I hear you saying, is we have a body in order to feel pleasure. Like, pleasure, hello, let's not, why are we repressing pleasure so much? Because when we repress pleasure, then we are emphasizing it, you know, when we repress pleasure, which is in the sacral root, you know, sacral chakra on earth, closer to the earth, then we're bringing, you know, we're emphasizing the mind, and that's where the imbalance happens in our bodies. But I love this, you know, I'm so glad that Anika, you brought this up, because this is it. Our body, the pleasure, the cycles that we experience are extremely valid and so important for us to have healthy, balanced lives, right? So important. Kailei.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll add a couple of things. One, creativity, that's the divine feminine too, right? Creativity, pleasure, play, like that is non-linear. That is not evidence-based. That is opening ourselves up to connect with the divine and having it flow through us. And, you know, I wasn't expecting for us to go here, but let's go here. I mean, when it comes to like sex and sensuality, that can be a spiritual experience, right? Like, that is not only tapping into the five senses. It's just not. So how much more pleasurable would our lives be if we took the taboo out of it, if we took the negativity of it, the shame of it out of it. I mean, even going back to, I mean, we've been talking about the Catholic Church. I grew up Catholic too. The fact that, you know, priests and nuns like had to be repressed, like how, like who came up with this? We're just not meant to be on earth suppressing pleasure. We're just not.
Truth, so much truth. I mean, if there's any, I mean, you know, I'm like, why did we not talk about this from the beginning? Because this makes, like, it really, like, it's the true essence of why there's an imbalance, right? Like, just repressing pleasure is the best mechanism for suppressing the divine feminine. Like, it's just, let's just suppress pleasure. And I mean, I mean, we all know what you know, all over earth and all religions, what harm is done to us, to women, especially as sexual beings. So I just got chills.
I just did too. And I was hoping to just add one quick thing. You know, something that Anika said, and I mean, what I'm hearing come forward is this notion of like past lives, or I call it other lives, because I believe that we exist in multiple dimensions and multiple times. Like, I try not to get too in the clouds with all of this, but we live other lives and we bring in those experiences, absolutely, but we also bring in the trauma. And the more that we kind of lean into the masculine and away from like really processing, because it is divine feminine to lean into those lives and say, okay, what do you have to teach me? What do I have to release? How can I live like my best life here? Like unfettered, the word is coming through, like unfettered. And we cannot live in our big way, like our big purpose and our wholeness here. We just cannot do it without examining our divine feminine and examining the other lives that we've lived, examining the ways in which that trauma shows up. I mean, it's shown up for me in terms of money. It's shown up for me in terms of like my wound around, and it was just 5:55 here. My wound around like being in relationship with men. I mean, it is a very, like, it will lead me in my life if I don't take ownership of it and begin to examine it for myself. And that requires trusting and surrendering to the divine feminine, right? So it's bigger than even just like the intuitive messages that we get day to day all the time. Like, it's bigger than that. It's also saying and committing to wanting to shift the trajectory of like your soul's journey. Like, it's big. Like, it's a big deal to begin to trust yourself and to begin to trust the divine feminine. And absolutely, like, sensual. And I'm just like always like one for pleasure, like, yes, please. And if that is not an incentive, maybe, some people are less sexual, whatever, but like, I just think of it as like living freely, allowing myself to seek out experiences where I feel alive, like more alive. That comes down to like sensuality. That comes down to like experiencing joy and love and these deeply like human and divine experiences that we're meant to have here. We can't do that in the fullest way that we're meant to if we're not exploring the parts of us that are unseen.
Ooh. Okay. This is so important. This part, I love how the weaving of the unseen, the divine feminine, tapping into our divine feminine energies in order to access other lives. And accessing other lives is a way that we heal the trauma that allows us to live our soul's desires in the life that we are currently living.
Yeah, like live as amplified as we can here, right? Like, I think of myself 2 years ago, I was like grayscale, right? But now I'm like full color and like colors going everywhere, right? And I can't live in this like fullest expression of myself if I'm allowing these kind of like unseen things take the wheel all the time because I'm just avoiding it or numbing it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that avoidance and that numbing is not only about related to what you experienced in this life. And that is the gift, the true gift that we all have, the potential that we have, all of us on earth, is to tap into those visions, that awareness. That is the deep wisdom that is accessible to everyone. It's not just accessible to gurus and it's accessible to everyone. And this is what the Three Luminaries are here to help you with. That's the bridge building. Oh my gosh, I got chills. The bridge building that we talked about at the beginning. This is the bridge building. How can we all have access to these channeled messages? We're not special here. Everybody can do this. Yeah. Anything else to add? There's so much. We could go on forever. Oh my gosh. Anything
we could.
else?
I just wanted to share. I feel like I need to say this to anyone listening, to keep seeking, when you feel that nudge, when you feel that twinge of something is right or something isn't right, get curious, keep seeking, because that is what we're talking about, accessing our other lives. It's all about gaining the wisdom and the knowledge, and that is divine feminine. Oh, by the way, as we've been talking about, all of these aspects of ourselves, whether it's here on this dimension or others, it's all to guide us, right? It's to guide us to ourselves, to our higher versions of ourselves, to the divine that's within us and all around us. So I just wanted to call that out.
I'm
Thank
hearing,
you. Thank you.
I'm hearing seek and rest.
Mm.
Seek and rest. Because at the end of the day, and this is, you know, I'm a spiritual guide and I support a lot of clients through connecting with their inner light. And I do notice a lot of people who are just like ready and raring to go. And they're like, let's do this. Let's do this. And I'm like, let's find stillness. Let's breathe, because seeking sometimes means letting it come to you. And that can only be achieved, or that can only be attained through this like kind of quiet, you know, I think it's like a balance of seeking and stillness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, it's so tempting to want to just like go, like for me, when I first started down this path, I was like out the gate. I mean, you know, Josette, you were there for all of the madness. And it was like, I was like seeking. And it wasn't until I started really reckoning with like, I'm working just as hard. Like and this is also not in balance. If I'm working this hard at like just being a channel, you know, there has to be that balance of like, allow it to also come to you. It's going to be both.
Seeking and receiving.
Yes.
Seek, still, receive, and present to the moment. And I love how that's, because really that's where the stillness comes in, right? It's like, Leilani says to me all the time, be here now. Like, what would it be like to be here now, like in this moment? And it's hard. It's often hard to allow ourselves to do that because of this whole, you know, we're at this action orientation. But there's something about it too that almost feels like we don't deserve to that like worthiness to be able to just be present in this moment. But we're missing so much when we don't allow ourselves to be there. And so it's like, I agree, it is seek. I agree, it is still. And it's allowing yourself to be present, to then take in what you are receiving, to enjoy the moment, to recognize the joy there. There's so much. I love when we process together because there's so many nuggets. And we were doing a workshop, our first Three Luminaries workshop, and we were talking about just kind of some of the journeys that we've been on. And Leilani said, she's like, I don't get caught up in getting to the end. I've always enjoyed the journey. And I was like, yeah, like I've heard that before, but like in that moment, I was like, I didn't enjoy that journey. So what would it look like? Okay, I did enjoy parts of the journey, but what would it look like to have intentionality to be present in the moment so that I could enjoy the journey? So seek and take it in, give yourself the time, that stillness, but enjoy, allow yourself to be there, be here now.
And just to be clear, be here now, that was the universe. That's source, that's God. And that is that was, you know, I have my own podcast, and the bumper sticker from Source when I interviewed Source was be here now, because now is the only moment that exists. The past is a collection of memories. The future is a collection of possibilities. Like now is the only moment that actually exists. And this is the moment where you can access divine feminine.
Oh, wow. Wisdom bombs all over the place. It's amazing. So good. So good. Well, I think that's it. You can all, I'm going to put this in the show notes. Everything that was shared here will be in the show notes. Any references, all the links to find all these three amazing women will be in the show notes. And I am just so grateful for you all to be here at this time. It was so easy for us to gather. It was divine. And I'm just so grateful for you all. So thank you so much. Feel free to unmute yourselves and say goodbye.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Josette.
I just want to thank you, Josette, for putting these conversations forward. It's so needed. Your voice is needed.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate you too. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for listening to this powerful conversation. I hope it's given you a taste of how you can bring more balance to the earth. Remember to get in touch with Anika, Kailei, and Leilani. Find their links in the show notes. But before you go, I wanted to share some exciting news with you. One of my greatest gifts and joys is to help light workers, coaches, healers, and visionaries find a balance between the dual energies we talked about in this episode so they can show up for their work in a way that's energizing. When you feel a balance between these two energies, it's much easier to express yourself without feeling doubt and fear of judgment. This is why I created the program Soul to Social. Soul to Social is an 8-week group coaching program designed to help you find the self-trust and energy you need to make your soul work visible. Because when you show up this way, you can connect with the people who need you while you do the work you love. No more feeling overwhelmed, lost, and alone online. Soul to Social starts again at the end of April 2020, so if you're interested, see the link in the show notes for more details. And if you're catching this episode at a later date, be sure to get on the wait list so you can be the first to get updates about when Soul to Social starts again. Once again, thanks so much for listening, and until next time, take good care.